Welcome back. You're watching Political Exchange, where we continue our conversation with Duncan de Groot from Empowerdex on just how far South African business have come in terms of ramping up black participation in the economy. Duncan, I want to talk a little bit more about the concept of broad-based black economic empowerment. We know that the concept has had to be almost refashioned, if you like, because it did suffer some credibility issues. How is the concept of broad-based black economic empowerment understood within, business today?
I think broad-based black economic empowerment is far better understood in business today. And certainly the broad-based aspects of broad-based black economic empowerment has made a significant difference. If we look at procurement as an element, and if we measure how procurement has tended over the last year or so, what we've seen is that on average, a measured entity's procurement score will improve. And the only way a measured entity's score can improve is for the underlying elements to improve along with it. So we've certainly seen with the implementation of broad-based black economic empowerment that companies are certainly considering who they hire, who they train, who they promote, who they purchase from, who they support from a black business perspective, as well as from their socio-economic development perspective. Is it fast enough? Is it quick enough? That's a different question, but certainly the evidence shows us that on the whole, measured entities, companies are taking broad-based black economic empowerment to heart.
Okay, now let's look at the links. I mean, one of the pressing issues around the economy is not just changing the racial profile of companies, but also ensuring that that change engenders job creation. Is there, in terms of the data that you have in front of you, a link between broad-based black economic empowerment, local procurement, and job creation?
That's one of the challenges, and one of the areas that the evidence shows that perhaps the measurement, the measurement at the moment that provides compliance is perhaps the wrong measurement to use, in that for a number of elements, enterprise development and socio-economic development, the compliance measurement is net profit after tax, which means provided that a company spends enough money, they will get the points. Whereas there is no focus and no basis on the sustainability of that underlying entity, of the creation of jobs within that underlying entity, of the growth of that entity. And what we were suggesting this morning is that perhaps the metric of measurement needs to be reconsidered.
Let's talk about that potential reconsideration. Build in that new metric for me elements that would address what we were just talking about. How would it have to change? What would need to be added?
Well, a number of areas we feel could provide benefit. One is to take some of the ownership, some of the focus from ownership and move it into the procurement element, where we place greater focus on procurement from 50% black owned and 30% black women owned, but also try to build in some form of measurement as to the sustainability of that underlying supplier, together with that the growth of that supplier, the local content procurement of that supplier as well. Because at the moment you can be a compliant producer, but import most of your product. And what we're wanting to do, what we've been suggesting is that what we need to do is to place a local content aspect within it. And what we have seen is across different areas of legislation, there is a far greater focus being placed on local content. Mm-hmm. And we are of the understanding that local content, when the new codes come out, will play a far better role. Likewise with enterprise development. Enterprise development at the moment is a percentage of your net profit after tax. There is no requirement on the measured entity, on the company at the moment, to ensure the ongoing profitability or the ongoing sustainability of that enterprise development beneficiary. Yeah. If that enterprise development beneficiary is no longer in business next year, companies will find another one. Mm-hmm. And we feel that in order to sustain and grow the economy, it would perhaps be far better to ensure that there is a sustainability component, that there is a profit growth component built into enterprise development.
Tell me, is there a component on the amount of jobs businesses create? Are companies going to be rewarded for having an index on employment, for example? Is that something to consider given the jobless crisis in South Africa?
Again, what we found with the independent power producers is that there is a job creation component that looks at not just job creation within the hands of black South Africans, but it also goes to local communities. At the moment, as far as the codes are concerned, we are looking at the existing makeup within a sub-element of employment equity, and we calculate the compliance from that perspective. Mm-hmm. What we have seen starting to, in one of the sector codes, the tourism sector code, what we have seen is a measurement of black first-time employees with no prior work experience. And that's the first measurement that we have seen that has some form of value placed on new employment created.
Yeah. Now,
and that is something that could be carried further into the codes.
Especially if one considers, for example, the pressure from youth unemployment. We know that youth unemployment is double the rate of general unemployment, and we're talking here about being able to track first-time entrance into the economy. Is that something that can be built, and can you spread that across the sectors?
Across the sectors or across the elements?
The elements, I'm sorry.
Again, I think it would be an important job creation, and unemployment is a real issue in South Africa. And the codes of good practice have had as one of their underlying requirements is to move people from the informal economy into the formal economy. And that occurs via creating jobs. So without having a true measurement to measure the creation of new jobs, not just in essence a shuffling of the deck by saying within that same number of jobs the black component is X, we aren't able to measure effectively new job creation. And it certainly is an element that could be considered.
Mm-hmm. Now, we constantly talk about broad-based black economic empowerment, and of course the empowerment of women, falls within that framework. Talk to me, is there anything in what you've found that gives us any proper data on the extent to which gender is a variable in broad-based black economic empowerment?
What we're seeing increasingly throughout the sector codes that have been gazetted is where we have this concept called the adjusted recognition for gender in the codes, which takes into account the black-female representation, but uses a formula to calculate it as a percentage of your total black representation. What we're finding with the sector codes is that they are starting to split out the black representation and then as a separate sub-element, the black-female representation. And that is starting to give us a far better picture as to what the black-female representation is. Whereas with the adjustment for gender, you can hide by having a very high black representation, a relatively small black-female representation, and still score well. So what we are seeing now is a splitting of the black representation as well as the black-female representation as its own sub-element. Mm-hmm. And that is certainly shining a far brighter light on the black-female representation.
Mm-hmm. Now tell me, just talk a little bit about this process. You've been before the portfolio committee now. What happens next?
Well, they asked us to give our input and our view via our experience as to the effectiveness of broad-based black economic empowerment, specifically with regards to local procurement, and then to give them some views as to what has worked and what hasn't worked. And what we gave was very much what we've been talking about, and the challenges that are faced, and how we feel that perhaps with a change in measurement, with a change in the underlying metric, that we could perhaps place more focus on job creation. There isn't a sufficient correlation between the improvement in a general company's B score with economic growth. Mm-hmm. And that was what we were trying to highlight, that by perhaps changing the metric, we could start to provide some further economic growth. My understanding is that the information is, they've asked us to come back to provide some other input on some other areas to go and collect some data for them. And my understanding is that it will now be debated within committee.
Mm-hmm. Now, the whole process of broad-based black economic empowerment and getting buy-in from companies to actually comply, there has been some sense from, certainly from industry side, that government tends to be punitive in terms of the way it interacts with business. What was it in your findings? Were you able to measure the extent to which people are happy with the kind of punitive arrangements, if you like, that are there to force compliance?
Well, what has occurred since December last year is that when a company is wanting to tender either to local, provincial or national government, they no longer merely need to provide their ownership credentials. They now need to submit a complete BE certificate. And that certainly has increased compliance, because without that BE certificate, you can't do business. You won't be able to tender effectively. Mm-hmm. So what we found is that companies on the whole have realized that it's a rule of the game, that if they want to interact with government, a compliant BE position is imperative.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of just the red tape of getting people to fill out those forms, in your view, how smooth is that process? Is it an interactive process, or does it just, increase the bureaucracy and the red tape?
Certainly, certain clients will feel that it's some bureaucracy and some red tapes, but I think a portion of that is dependent on the verification agencies as well to assist.
And how effective are
companies
they?
Through the process. We feel that it isn't a particularly onerous process. It certainly is a document-heavy process, but it is something that a lot of companies have been doing for a number of years. They have got their systems in place, their reporting systems in place, and generally it's not as onerous an undertaking as it perhaps was first perceived to be.
Yeah. Now, just in terms of the difference between how larger companies and smaller companies are performing, is there a very discernible, difference in how larger companies are able to navigate their way around the codes? And if so, what makes them more able? Is it the fact that systems are in place?
Yeah, there's no doubt that on average that a smaller company, what's known as a qualifying small enterprise, so a company with a turnover less than 35 million rand, on average will perform better than a large company, a company over 35 million rand. And that's because of the rules as to what they are required to comply with. Not least of all is the fact that they only have to choose 4 of the 7 elements. Whereas a generic company, a company over 35 million rand, needs to comply with all 7 elements. And within each element, there are further sub-elements. The targets tend to be higher, the points tend to be, the points are less for each sub-element. And generic companies have far more hurdles to jump over. And therefore, plus large companies have a requirement to measure black disabled employees, which smaller companies don't. So certainly smaller companies, it is easier, and I think that is fine, because it is getting companies into the swing of providing compliance via a BE certificate. But once they've got to a 35 million rand turnover level, there is a company that's large enough to have put systems in place. But absolutely, we're required to determine a score on the basis of evidence. And what we certainly find with bigger companies who come and do a rating for the first time is that although they might be doing a number of initiatives, the evidence isn't there to substantiate that claim. And once they get the systems in place, we find that their scores increase commensurate with that.
Well, that's where we have to leave it. Tune in again tomorrow night for another edition of Political Exchange. I'm Karima Brown. Goodbye.